Okay, first things first, to download this, if you're already on Halo Infinite, you have to go to the Community tab and then come down here where you see Browse All. And when you pull this up, move over to the right and type either in keywords or tags, just type Spring, and then it should still pop up. You don't have to type the full thing. I think if you put a space, it has a problem, but when you search Spring, you should find this one that says Spring Jump Script. And then to make sure that this is the right one, when you pull it up, you'll see my name under the owner and creator, and when you go to credits, you'll see me and diversity. So this is the right one that you're looking for, and then you just simply press bookmark. The other way you can do this is on Halo Waypoint, and for this you'll need to be signed in, which you can normally find on the top right here. But when you're signed in, go ahead and click Games, select Halo Infinite, click on Content Browser, and then scroll down until you see Browse All Content. Once you click here, now you'll be prompted to search with your keyword, just type Spring. And when you search that, if you're still not finding it, you can click here to narrow it down to prefabs, doesn't matter. And then find the one that says Spring Jump Script like we saw before. And then to make sure that this is the right one, you should see diversity in my name here. And then go ahead and just select bookmark and feel free to rate it as well. Okay, so after you download our Spring Jump script, if you don't already know, you're going to have to load into Forge on a map that you can save. And then it doesn't matter if it's out of the map or in, you press Y to pull up your object browser, access the prefabs, and then this is where you find that Spring Jump script. So when you spawn it, you'll notice that it's actually two objects. It's a script brain attached to a pointer, and you don't need both of these objects, but we do, so that we can save it as a prefab for you. And if you don't want this pointer attached to it, it's not doing anything, but if you don't want it, while you're holding this group, you hold X and then hold up to ungroup it, and then you just deselect the script brain or both, and then hover over the pointer and then press left on the D-pad to delete it. That'll just leave you with the script brain, and this is what you'll need to actually be able to do the spring jump. So let's take a peek at it. So while you're holding it, hold Y and then hold up to get to the node graph for it. And then this right here is the whole script brain for what is possible and how it achieves the spring jump. So let's dive into it to see what's actually going on. So in node graphs, you'll most likely be working from the left to the right because they work in a step-by-step like fashion. So let's start over here. You'll see this is a blue event node called onPlayerCrouch. So what this does is simply just gets you a player, and it determines if that player is crouching, which we will need both of these for a spring jump, so this is a must. So to see what it leads to next, we need to follow this pin and only pay attention to that line, and we'll see it leads to this logic node called a branch, which just simply checks if a condition is true or false. So let's see what that condition is. We'll just follow this line and see that connects to is crouching. So it's checking if this player is crouching, and if that is true, that'll bring us up to here, and if it's false, that'll bring us down to here. But let's start up here at the set object list variable. And like I said, it can help by moving from left to right, so we'll go ahead and do that here. So over here we are getting an object list variable, but whenever you are creating a variable, you're going to have to first declare it, which is essentially just setting it up initially. So right here we have the identifier, which is just the name of it, and we are calling it crouch list. We have no initial objects in here, that's why this is empty, and then we have the scope set to global, which normally we would actually have it set to local, which would essentially just lock this information exclusively into this script brain, and then having it set to global will allow other script brains on the map to access this information, which we wouldn't really want, so we wanted to put it on local. But for whatever reason, we were having an issue where if another script brain on the map was using the object reference node, that would somehow get intertwined with our script brain. And then we are also having an issue where when we would delete our script brain, somehow the script that was actually in it wouldn't get deleted and would instead be like embedded in the map itself, and we couldn't figure out how to delete that. So we just opted to stick with global for our scopes. So the only difference with this is that other script brains, if they are using the exact same identifiers that we are, like crouch_list for example, there may be some overlaps, but other than that, there shouldn't really be any issues. But I'm just pointing that out just in case there are some issues. Anyway, so we have this object list variable declared, and now down here we are getting that object list variable crouch list, and we are just taking that object list and putting it through here, where we then are adding an object to that list, and that object is the player. So we are adding that player to the crouch list, and then we are generating this new updated list, and then we are channeling it into here for the value. So at this point, we are just setting crouch list to be the updated crouch list here, which now includes the player. And so if they crouch, remember that's the condition here, if the player crouches, that would be true, then they would be on this crouch list. They would be included on it. So let's take a look down here really quick. So if they do not crouch, this would return as false, and that would bring us down here where we are also setting an object list variable for crouch list, only this time the value is going to be removing this object from list, and the object is, as you can imagine, it's also the player. So we would be removing the player from this crouch list here, and that would be the new updated list, and that would be the value here. So if they do not crouch, they will no longer be on this crouch list. They would be removed from it. So let's see what happens next. So this is connected to a trigger custom event node that we have an identifier for called spring check. And the object here is also going to be the player, and that's going to be ran through this node, which means that it will be carried over when we have this custom event called spring check happen. So when we look up here, this is when they are on the list. This is when they crouch, they are on this list. We will also be doing that same custom event that we're triggering, the spring check, where the player is also being carried over through it. Only this time we will also be triggering a custom event called spring jump, where the player is also being carried over. And that covers all of this area. The top left section, this is all done. So just as a quick recap, this is just checking for when a player crouches. If they are crouched, we will put them on this crouch list. We are adding them to it. If they don't crouch, then we are removing them from this crouch list. They are no longer on it. So what this determines is just simply if a player is crouched, they're on the crouch list. And if they are not crouched, they are not on the crouch list. So just as simple as that. So if you remember, we were ending this one with the spring check custom event. As with this one, we were also doing the same thing. So if we move along here, this is where spring check occurs. This is on custom event. So over here, remember this object is being carried over, and it is the player that we determined earlier. And if we follow this, we'll see the first thing that's happening is just a condition check of whether that player is airborne. So if they are not airborne, this is false, and that must mean that they're still grounded and sitting on something. So at this point, we'll be waiting a very short period of 0.01 seconds, which is basically no time, before we trigger the same custom event of spring check. And what that would do was put us right back down here, and it will put us into a loop where it's constantly checking again and again and again to make sure that are we still grounded on the floor, and if we are, then it's false. And we wouldn't normally need this wait for n seconds, but without it we were experiencing some crashes, so this prevented that. But if we do become airborne, then this returns true. And if that's the case, we're going to be waiting another 0.01 seconds before we check once again, are they still airborne? Because they already were airborne, are they still airborne? If that's true, then we're going to have to do the same spring check. Put them back in the loop. Because we're curious, we already know that they're airborne, that'll be true. We want to know when are they no longer airborne? Because when they are no longer airborne, this will return false. That means that they are grounded, that they have now landed after becoming airborne. So now we want to know this condition. Is this object in the list? And the object is this object, which is the player being carried over from the previous event. So we want to know, is the player in this object list, which is the crouch list? So is the player in this crouch list? Because if they are, that means that they're crouching, and if that's true, they have primed the spring jump, because remember, Over here, they have gone airborne, and the moment that they touch the ground, if they are crouched, if they are fully crouched upon touching the ground, they will be priming this spring jump. So as you can see, we have this object list variable, spring list, which we declare right here. There's nothing in it, so we have to set it this value, which we get from a new object list, upon adding an object to a list. And that object, if you're catching on, that's great, but the object is the player that's being carried over from the previous event. And that object, the player, is being added to the blank spring list, okay? And so that would return the new spring list that has the player in it. So that's what's happening here. So once again, the player goes airborne, and as soon as they land on the ground, if they are crouched, this will be true, then they will be on this spring list. And that just about covers this section, but let's just do a quick review anyway, just so that we can see where we are so far. So we're checking for a player crouching, and if they crouch, they will be put onto this crouch list, and if they don't crouch, or if they uncrouch, they'll be removed from this crouch list. But regardless, we're going to be doing a spring check on each, which we were just looking at over here, which essentially is just checking if the player goes airborne, when do they land? And when they land, are they crouching? Have they landed crouched? Because if they have, then they have primed the spring jump. So that's what we were just looking at here. But remember, if they are also on the crouch list, not only do we do this spring check, but we also do this other custom event that we're calling a spring jump. And that brings us down here to this third area. So just as we did before, the object here is actually just going to be that player carried over. And the first thing that we're going to be doing is checking a condition. We're going to be checking if that player is in this list, the spring list. Because as soon as they are in that list, which happens at the end of the section we were just looking at, this will return true. And if that's true, then we'll be looking at another condition. We'll be checking, well, how about now? After they have primed the spring jump, have they become airborne? Because if they have, then they just reset the spring condition. And we're gonna have to change this spring list, not to the one that they're on, but to one where we remove the player from that list. We want to return this new list that doesn't have the player on this spring list, because if they reset the spring condition, we don't want them on this spring list anymore. But let's just wait 0.01 seconds anyway, because if they were trying a spring jump, then we need to check how were they crouching. So that's why we have this crouch list. We are wondering, are they in it still? Because if they are crouching immediately after becoming airborne, which at this point it's 0.01 seconds afterward, if they still are crouching, well, there's no chance that they got a spring jump. So we have to do the spring check again, and then also perform the spring jump custom event, which is this whole section down here. It's the whole start of it. So then it'll put us back in here. But let's say they do become airborne, but this time when we get here, we check if they're on the crouch list, and they are not on the crouch list. Why is this one a different one? Well, at this point, they would be uncrouching only 0.01 seconds after they go airborne. And if this means that they jumped, that's effectively saying that they have uncrouched right when they jumped. And if that's the case, then we're gonna have to trigger this custom event, a new one that we're calling execute spring. Now, before I get into execute spring, let's dial it back a little bit. Let's go back to here. If they already primed this spring jump, and we are checking if they have now gone airborne, but they are still grounded, then we're gonna have to come down here, where we then check if this player is still on the crouch list, because if they are, well, then nothing really happened. We know that they landed crouched from a fall, and if they haven't gone airborne, then they must still be crouching, so nothing happened. So we wait 0.01 seconds, and then we trigger this custom event again, this spring jump, which would put us back at the start of this, and then run us through the same process. Now let's say this time though, when we check for the player to be on this crouch list, they aren't on the crouch list. Now this would mean that they have uncrouched, right? Now something's happening here. Immediately we can see that we need to be resetting the spring condition So that's what this value is. When we come up to here, we'll see it's the same thing that we did previously. We remove the player from the spring list. So when we come down here, that's what's happening. So they uncrouch and immediately they are no longer on the spring list. But we are going to wait 0.01 seconds, and now we're going to check this condition, which is just simply the airborne check. Because if they do go airborne immediately after uncrouching, well, that might mean that they're jumping. And if that's true, they're basically uncrouching right when they jump. So we're going to trigger this custom event for execute spring. And up here, we have the actual on custom event for execute spring. And this object coming out of it is just a player passing through this object. Once again, we're using it to carry over and use later on. So to reiterate what execute spring is, just in case you don't recall. So up here, the player goes airborne, and then only 0.01 seconds later, if they are not on the crouch list, that means that they have uncrouched only 0.01 seconds later. That's basically simultaneous as they went airborne. And that's what triggers the execute spring up here. Now the one down here, it's the same, but actually the opposite. You uncrouch first, and only 0.01 seconds later, you then go airborne. But that's basically no time. So you uncrouch and you go airborne basically at the same time. So that would execute spring. So that's what brings us here. And at this moment, the player has basically earned their spring jump, but we have to do one more final check, because what if when they went airborne, that wasn't them actually jumping? So here's how we check that. So we first of all, we get the player's velocity, and that's what this object is. We get the player's velocity, which divides it into here among these axes. And then we check the Z axis, which is just the vertical axis. And then we see, that's what operand A is. And then we see, is that vertical velocity greater than 0? Meaning, is it positive? Because if it's positive, that means that they are moving up. And if they are moving up from the ground, they must be jumping. So if that's the case, then this is true, and they have earned their spring jump finally. And we give them that spring jump by giving them a velocity boost. So over here, we just get the player's velocity, and then we use this get vector axis value to get the velocity per axis. And we're just concerned with Z, because like I said, it's responsible for vertical. So we take the player's current vertical velocity and plug that into operand A, and then multiply that by operand B, which is 1.35. And we're using this number in particular because that's a number I came up with when looking at spring jumps on Halo 5. I estimated that spring jumps were roughly 35% greater than a regular jump, so that's what we are using here. And it may not scale perfectly on Halo Infinite, it might be different proportionally, but it still seems appropriate, so that's what we are using here. We are plugging that into the new vertical velocity, and that's how we are setting the player's velocity here. And that's how you get the spring jump. So all of this does all of that. So just as a quick little rundown in a nutshell, so up here, we just simply figure out if the player's crouched, put them onto a list. If they're not, take them off the list. Over here, the spring check just determines if they go airborne, when do they land, and if they land, are they crouched? If so, put them into this, and if this happens, we are just looking for when they jump, are they also uncrouching? And if they time that close enough to these windows, then they will get this spring jump. And then this, like I just showed, is how you actually get that velocity boost for your spring jump. So there you go. I hope that helped.